Hi all, National Master Stephen Adams here. We're going to talk about one of the most thematic pawn breaks in chess today. That is, we're going to examine the d5 break in the Sicilian Defense. Now, getting to play d5 is one of the main objectives in several variations of the Sicilian, including the Najdorf, the Taimanov, the Scheveningen, Kahn, probably a couple others too. And the purpose of this video is to help you understand when it's a good idea to play this d5 break. I go by three main principles. The first of which is, in a series of exchanges, you always want to recapture on d5 with a piece. If at any point you're ever playing the move e takes d5, you're doing something wrong. You never want to have to capture on d5 in these typical Sicilian structures with a pawn, because you get an isolated queen's pawn as well as you blunt your knight on f6, as the knight will just be very restricted mobility. The knight wants to recapture on d5, so the knight would be very restricted in mobility, and the bishop on b7 would be restricted as well as you cut the diagonal. So you want to take on d5 with your minor pieces, so that you keep a compact structure and active pieces. So with this in mind, you also need to be watchful for deflections on your pieces controlling this d5 square when you go for that pawn push. The second of these principles I go by is you need to consider white's potential response by pushing past with e5. If white can maintain a pawn on e5 with your bishop developed on b7, it's possible for white to blockade your newly placed pawn on d5 with a minor piece on d4, and that would render the bishop on b7 a bad piece that's hemmed in by its own pawns. So, you should play d5 only if you have this e5 square under control so that white can't push e5, or if they can push e5 but you can pressure this e5 pawn and capture it. These are usually tactical considerations, as black has to play energetically before white can consolidate the center with like e5 and f4 with support, for example. Okay, so a third of these considerations is, after a massive series of exchanges on the d-file, white sometimes has a very powerful pawn break with a4, using the influence of the light square bishop to attack the a6 and b5 pawn formations. This is most common when white is either uncastled or castle kingside with their rook on a1. You don't see it as much when they have castle queenside, but it still is a consideration. Let's take a look now at a few positions. This first example comes from a tournament game of mine from a few months ago. Here white has played the move queen to b6 on their previous move, inviting a queen trade. So we have to consider if first we want to push d5, and secondly if we want to initiate the queen trade before doing so. So we have to decide if d5 is something we want to do in the first place, and if so, what's the best way to do it. If we push d5 right away, white can trade the queens and then play this g5 move, deflecting our knight away from the f6 square, and after something like knight d7, we're even losing our d5 pawn. And so we can disregard the immediate d5 push, and we can look at now at throwing in the queen trade. So after queen b6, we can trade the queens and now consider playing d5. So if we play d5, then we have to consider the deflection with g5, the push with e5, and mass exchanges on d5, followed by a4 at the very end. So, first of all, if white pushes g5 in this position, then after knight d7, black is hitting both the bishop on b6, but also this g5 pawn. So after bishop e3 to guard both of these, black can deflect the white knight off of c3, and after this b4 push and white has to move their knight away to either a4 or b1, we can win the e4 pawn. So white's not able to go g5, they'll lose a pawn by force. So let's now consider if they try to push and keep the center closed. So after knight d7, we're again attacking a bishop and a pawn at the same time. So white will have to go bishop d4 to defend. And here, black has this tactical resource, bishop g5 check, king to b1, and bishop f4, ganging up on this e5 pawn. And white doesn't have the opportunity. They can't play f4, not a legal move, and white cannot defend the e5 pawn with another piece, and so black will simply capture it next move. The last thing that we have to consider, and what actually happened in the game, is mass trades on d5 followed by a4. But here, black again has a tactical resource. I just continued with bishop to b3, and this forks the pawns on c2 and a4. This bishop is immune, of course, because of the pin on the king, and I was able to win a pawn and later the game due to this tactic. So those three considerations are what you have to keep in mind when looking at the d5 break. Let's look at another position where black again has the option to play for d5. And here after d5, if white captures, we're able to recapture with the bishop and have excellent piece activity targeting the weaknesses white has created on both sides of the board. If white pushes past with e5, we need a way to dislodge this e5 pawn. However, white can quickly reinforce with f4, and suddenly with the closed center, black's pieces stand very badly. The bishop on b7 is completely blocked in by its pawns, and the knight on h5 is actually trapped now and is vulnerable to a maneuver like bishop h3 to g4. So, due to the standing of the pieces and this pawn structure, we can conclude that d5 in this position is a bad move. We can remember, however, that your opponent's good pawn move is your good pawn move, and if we lead ourselves with the pawn push e5 and white retreats with bishop e3, now if we continue with this d5 move, we can break in the center, and although it might look like temporarily, black might be losing a pawn because this pawn is attacked way more times than it's defended. Black does have a tactical resource because this c2 pawn is vulnerable, and after king a1, rook out to d8, and with a skewer on this rook and attacking the queen at the same time, this is just game over. So we again see that tactical resources do enable the d5 break. Let's look at this last position that came from a blitz game where I played the knight orf. Here, black can consider the pawn push with d5. First off, after a series of captures, we're always able to take back with a minor piece, and we've eliminated white's pawn on e4, and now black has better control of the center. Secondly, they can't really push past with e5 because we're controlling the square with the knight, so that's just not an option for them. The last motif that we have to consider is a mass exchange on d5. Even though we're able to capture with all our minor pieces, we have to consider this potential a4 push for white. And here, this a4 break is actually set up perfectly for white. First off, their rook is on a1, so the opening of the a file will greatly benefit them. And black's rook is busy on the c file. Black's bishop has also left the defense of this a6 pawn while it's on the d5 square. And so, if white does trade on d5 and pushes a4, black is actually losing a pawn here by force. Even if they take on a4, white can take on a6 and win the a4 pawn either next move or sometime very shortly in the future. And with these two connected pass pawns, white will have a large advantage. So, with this in mind, black should not push d5 in this position because this a4 break at the end of the trading sequence will be very powerful for white. And so the best move is probably to castle and hold off on this d5 break until a later moment. So that's everything for today. I hope this was instructive and helped to clarify a few things regarding this thematic push in the Sicilian. Thanks for watching. Bye.